Question 6, Part 1 of Summa Theologica, Pars Prima Secundae, on the last end and on human acts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. Summa Theologica, Pars Prima Secundae, on the last end and on human acts, by St. Thomas Aquinas. Translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 6. Of the voluntary and the involuntary, in 8 articles. Part 1. Since therefore happiness is to be gained by means of certain acts, we must in due sequence consider human acts, in order to know by what acts we may obtain happiness, and by what acts we are prevented from obtaining it. But because operations and acts are concerned with things singular, consequently all practical knowledge is incomplete unless it take account of things in detail. The study of morals, therefore, since it treats of human acts, should consider first the general principles, and secondly, matters of detail. In treating of the general principles, the points that offer themselves for our consideration are: 1. Human acts themselves. 2. Their principles. Now of human acts some are proper to man, others are common to man and animals. And since happiness is man's proper good, those acts which are proper to man have a closer connection with happiness than have those which are common to man and the other animals. First then we must consider those acts which are proper to man. Secondly, those acts which are common to man and the other animals, and are called passions. The first of these points offers a twofold consideration. 1. What makes a human act? 2. What distinguishes human acts? And since those acts are properly called human which are voluntary, because the will is the rational appetite, which is proper to man, we must consider acts in so far as they are voluntary. First, then, we must consider the voluntary and involuntary in general. Secondly, those acts which are voluntary, as being elicited by the will, and as issuing from the will immediately. Thirdly, those acts which are voluntary, as being commanded by the will, which issue from the will through the medium of the other powers. And because voluntary acts have certain circumstances, according to which we form our judgment concerning them, we must first consider the voluntary and the involuntary, and afterwards the circumstances of those acts which are found to be voluntary or involuntary. Under the first head there are 8 points of inquiry. 1. Whether there is anything voluntary in human acts. 2. Whether in irrational animals. 3. Whether there can be voluntariness without any action. 4. Whether violence can be done to the will. 5. Whether violence causes involuntariness. 6. Whether fear causes involuntariness. 7. Whether concupiscence causes involuntariness. 8. Whether ignorance causes involuntariness. First article, Part 1 of the second part, Question 6, Article 1. Whether there is anything voluntary in human acts? Objection 1. It would seem that there is nothing voluntary in human acts, for that is voluntary, which has its principle within itself, as Gregory of Nyssa, Nemesius, On the Human Nature, 32. Damascene, On the Orthodox Faith, 2:24, and Aristotle, Ethics, 3:1, declare. But the principle of human acts is not in man himself, but outside him, since man's appetite is moved to act by the appetitable object which is outside him, and is as a mover unmoved. De Anima iii, 10. Therefore there is nothing voluntary in human acts. Obj. 2. Further, the Philosopher (Phys. viii, 2) proves that in animals no new movement arises that is not preceded by a motion from without. But all human acts are new, since none is eternal. Consequently, the principle of all human acts is from without, and therefore there is nothing voluntary in them. Obj. 3. Further, he that acts voluntarily can act of himself, but this is not true of man, for it is written, John 15:5, "Without me you can do nothing." Therefore there is nothing voluntary in human acts. On the contrary, Damascene says (De Fide Orth. ii) that "the voluntary is an act consisting in a rational operation." Now such are human acts. Therefore there is something voluntary in human acts. I answer that, there must needs be something voluntary in human acts. In order to make this clear, we must take note that the principle of some acts or movements is within the agent, or that which is moved, whereas the principle of some movements or acts is outside. For when a stone is moved upwards, the principle of this movement is outside the stone, whereas when it is moved downwards, the principle of this movement is in the stone. Now of those things that are moved by an intrinsic principle, some move themselves, some not. For since every agent or thing moved acts or is moved for an end, as stated above (Q. 1, A. 2), those are perfectly moved by an intrinsic principle, whose intrinsic principle is one not only of movement, but of movement for an end. Now in order for a thing to be done for an end, some knowledge of the end is necessary. Therefore, whatever so acts or is moved by an intrinsic principle, that it has some knowledge of the end, has within itself the principle of its act, so that it not only acts, but acts for an end. On the other hand, if a thing has no knowledge of the end, even though it have an intrinsic principle of action or movement, nevertheless, the principle of acting or being moved for an end is not in that thing, but in something else, by which the principle of its action towards an end is not in that thing, but in something else, by which the principle of its action towards an end is imprinted on it. Wherefore such like things are not said to move themselves, but to be moved by others. But those things which have a knowledge of the end are said to move themselves, because there is in them a principle by which they not only act, but also act for an end. And consequently, since both are from an intrinsic principle, to wit, that they act and that they act for an end, the movements of such things are said to be voluntary. For the word voluntary implies that their movements and acts are from their own inclination. Hence it is that, according to the definitions of Aristotle, Gregory of Nyssa, and Damascene, note, see Objection 1. The voluntary is defined not only as having a principle within the agent, but also in implying knowledge. Therefore, since man especially knows the end of his work and moves himself, in his acts especially is the voluntary to be found. Reply Obj. 1. Not every principle is a first principle. Therefore, although it is essential to the voluntary act that its principle be within the agent, nevertheless it is not contrary to the nature of the voluntary act that this intrinsic principle be caused or moved by an extrinsic principle, because it is not essential to the voluntary act that its intrinsic principle be a first principle. Yet again it must be observed that a principle of movement may happen to be first in a genus, but not first simply. Thus in the genus of things subject to alteration, the first principle of alteration is a heavenly body, which nevertheless is not the first mover simply, but is moved locally by a higher mover. And so the intrinsic principle of the voluntary act, for example, the cognitive and appetitive power, is the first principle in the genus of appetitive movement, although it is moved by an extrinsic principle according to other species of movement. Reply Obj. 2. New movements in animals are indeed preceded by a motion from without, and this in two respects. First, in so far as by means of an extrinsic movement an animal's senses are confronted with something sensible, which on being apprehended moves the appetite. Thus a lion, on seeing a stag in movement and coming towards him, begins to move towards the stag. Secondly, in so far as some extrinsic movement produces a physical change in an animal's body, as in the case of cold or heat, and through the body being affected by the motion of an outward body, the sensitive appetite, which is the power of a bodily organ, is also moved indirectly. Thus it happens that through some alteration in the body the appetite is roused to the desire of something. But this is not contrary to the nature of voluntariness, as stated above (ad 1). For such movements caused by an extrinsic principle are of another genus of movement. Reply Obj. 3: God moves man to act, not only by proposing the appetitable to the senses, or by effecting a change in his body, but also by moving the will itself; because every movement, either of the will or of nature, proceeds from God as the first mover. And just as it is not incompatible with nature that the natural movement be from God as the first mover, inasmuch as nature is an instrument of God moving it, so it is not contrary to the essence of a voluntary act that it proceed from God, inasmuch as the will is moved by God. Nevertheless, both natural and voluntary movements have this in common, that it is essential that they should proceed from a principle within the agent. Second article, part 1 of the second part, question 6, article 2. Whether there is anything voluntary in irrational animals? Objection 1. It would seem that there is nothing voluntary in irrational animals, for a thing is called voluntary from voluntas, or will. Now since the will is in the reason (De Anima iii, 9), it cannot be in irrational animals. Therefore neither is there anything voluntary in them. Obj. 2. Further, according as human acts are voluntary, man is said to be master of his actions. But irrational animals are not masters of their actions, for they act not, rather are they acted upon, as Damascene says (De Fide Orth. ii, 27). Therefore there is no such thing as a voluntary act in irrational animals. Obj. 3. Further, Damascene says (De Fide Orth. 24) that voluntary acts lead to praise and blame. But neither praise nor blame is due to the acts of irrational minds. Therefore such acts are not voluntary. On the contrary, the Philosopher says (Ethic. iii, 2) that both children and irrational animals participate in the voluntary. The same is said by Damascene (De Fide Orth. 24), and Gregory of Nyssa (Nemesius, De Human Nature, 32). I answer that, as stated above (A. 1), it is essential to the voluntary act that its principle be within the agent, together with some knowledge of the end. Now knowledge of the end is twofold, perfect and imperfect. Perfect knowledge of the end consists in not only apprehending the thing which is the end, but also in knowing it under the aspect of end and the relationship of the means to that end. And such knowledge belongs to none but the rational nature. But imperfect knowledge of the end consists in mere apprehension of the end, without knowing it under the aspect of end, or the relationship of an act to the end. Such knowledge of the end is exercised by irrational animals, through their senses and through their natural estimative power. Consequently, perfect knowledge of the end leads to the perfect voluntary, inasmuch as, having apprehended the end, a man can, from deliberating about the end and the means thereto, be moved, or not, to gain that end. But imperfect knowledge of the end leads to the imperfect voluntary, inasmuch as the agent apprehends the end, but does not deliberate, and is moved to the end at once. Wherefore the voluntary in its perfection belongs to none but the rational nature, whereas the imperfect voluntary is within the competency of even irrational animals. Reply Obj. 1. The will is the name of the rational appetite, and consequently it cannot be in things devoid of reason. But the word voluntary is derived from voluntas, or will, and can be extended to those things in which there is some participation of will by way of likeness thereto. It is thus that voluntary action is attributed to irrational animals, in so far as they are moved to an end through some kind of knowledge. Reply Obj. 2. The fact that man is master of his actions is due to his being able to deliberate about them. For since the deliberating reason is indifferently disposed to opposite things, The will can be inclined to either. But it is not thus that voluntariness is in irrational animals, as stated above. Reply Obj. 3. Praise and blame are the result of the voluntary act, wherein is the perfect voluntary, such as is not to be found in irrational animals. Third article, part 1 of the second part, question 6, article 3. Whether there can be voluntariness without any act? Objection 1. It would seem that voluntariness cannot be without any act, for that is voluntary which proceeds from the will. But nothing can proceed from the will except through some act, at least an act of the will. Therefore there cannot be voluntariness without act. Objection 2. Further, just as one is said to wish by an act of the will, so when the act of the will ceases, one is said not to wish. But not to wish implies involuntariness, which is contrary to voluntariness. Therefore there can be nothing voluntary when the act of the will ceases. Objection 3. Further, knowledge is essential to the voluntary, as stated above (articles 1 and 2). But knowledge involves an act. Therefore voluntariness cannot be without some act. On the contrary, the word voluntary is applied to that of which we are masters. Now we are masters in respect of to act and not to act, to will and not to will. Therefore just as to act and to will are voluntary, so also are not to act and not to will. I answer that, voluntary is what proceeds from the will. Now one thing proceeds from another in two ways. First, directly, in which sense something proceeds from another inasmuch as this other acts. For instance, heating from heat. Secondly, indirectly, in which sense something proceeds from another through this other not acting. Thus the sinking of a ship is set down to the helmsman from his having ceased to steer. But we must take note that the cause of what follows from want of action is not always the agent as not acting, but only then when the agent can and ought to act. For if the helmsman were unable to steer the ship, or if the ship's helm be not entrusted to him, the sinking of the ship would not be set down to him, although it might be due to his absence from the helm. Since then the will by willing and acting is able, and sometimes ought, to hinder not willing and not acting, this not willing and not acting is imputed to, as though proceeding from, the will. And thus it is that we can have the voluntary without an act, sometimes without outward act, but with interior act. For instance, when one wills not to act, and sometimes without even an interior act, when one does not will to act. Reply Obj. 1. We apply the word voluntary not only to that which proceeds from the will directly, as from its action, but also to that which proceeds from it indirectly, as from its inaction. Reply Obj. 2. Not to wish is said in two senses. First, as though it were one word, and the infinitive of I do not wish. Consequently, just as when I say I do not wish to read, the sense is I wish not to read. So not to wish to read is the same as to wish not to read. And in this sense, not to wish implies involuntariness. Secondly, it is taken as a sentence, and then no act of the will is affirmed, and in this sense, not to wish does not imply involuntariness. Reply Obj. 3. Voluntariness requires an act of knowledge in the same way as it requires an act of will, namely, in order that it be in one's power to consider, to wish and to act. And then, just as not to wish and not to act, when it is time to wish and to act, is voluntary, so it is voluntary not to consider. Fourth article, part 1 of the second part, question 6, article 4. Whether violence can be done to the will? Objection 1. It would seem that violence can be done to the will, for everything can be compelled by that which is more powerful. But there is something, namely God, that is more powerful than the human will, therefore it can be compelled, at least by him. Objection 2. Further, every passive subject is compelled by its active principle, when it is changed by it. But the will is a passive force, for it is a mover moved. De Anima iii, 10. Therefore, since it is sometimes moved by its active principle, it seems that sometimes it is compelled. Obj. 3: Further, violent movement is that which is contrary to nature. But the movement of the will is sometimes contrary to nature, as is clear of the will's movement to sin, which is contrary to nature, as Damascene says (De Fide Orth. iv, 20). Therefore the movement of the will can be compelled. On the contrary, Augustine says (De Civ. Dei v, 10) that what is done by the will is not done of necessity. Now whatever is done under compulsion is done of necessity. Consequently, what is done by the will cannot be compelled. Therefore the will cannot be compelled to act. I answer that, the act of the will is twofold. One is its immediate act, as it were, elicited by it, namely, to wish. The other is an act of the will commanded by it, and put into execution by means of some other power, such as to walk and to speak, which are commanded by the will to be executed by means of the motive power. As regards the commanded acts of the will, then the will can suffer violence, in so far as violence can prevent the exterior members from executing the will's command. But as to the will's own proper act, violence cannot be done to the will. The reason of this is that the act of the will is nothing else than an inclination proceeding from the interior principle of knowledge, just as the natural appetite is an inclination proceeding from an interior principle without knowledge. Now what is compelled or violent is from an exterior principle. Consequently, it is contrary to the nature of the will's own act that it should be subject to compulsion and violence, just as it is also contrary to the nature of a natural inclination or movement. For a stone may have an upward movement from violence, but that this violent movement be from its natural inclination is impossible. In like manner a man may be dragged by force, but it is contrary to the very notion of violence that he be dragged of his own will. Reply Obj. 1: God, who is more powerful than the human will, can move the will of man, according to Prov. 21:1. The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord; whithersoever he will, he shall turn it. But if this were by compulsion, it would no longer be by an act of the will, nor would the will itself be moved, but something else against the will. Reply Obj. 2: It is not always a violent movement when a passive subject is moved by its active principle, but only when this is done against the interior inclination of the passive subject. Otherwise, every alteration and generation of simple bodies would be unnatural and violent; whereas they are natural by reason of the natural interior aptitude of the matter or subject to such a disposition. In like manner, when the will is moved, according to its own inclination, by the appetible object, this movement is not violent but voluntary. Reply Obj. 3: That to which the will tends by sinning, although in reality it is evil and contrary to the rational nature, nevertheless is apprehended as something good and suitable to nature, in so far as it is suitable to man by reason of some pleasurable sensation or some vicious habit. End of Question 6, Part 1.